It is the week before Pesach, known otherwise as maybe the most busy and chaotic week of the year. And not only is it a busy and chaotic week each year, this year in particular, the Wolbys are behind. We're behind in schedule. And I had two interesting episodes last night. I was listening to a lecture by a great rabbi who was visiting Houston, and there was a question and answer session. And one of the questions, I forgot what it was about, but the person said, the great rabbi said, well, everyone has anxiety, right? That was like a line. I'm like, everyone has anxiety? Wolbies don't have anxiety. That was episode number 1. And then I get home and my wife tells me my son Yitzi has anxiety. He has anxiety about Pesach. So first of all, that was a little bit of a humbling for me that, maybe a few minutes after I boldly declared to myself in my own brain, Wolbies don't have anxiety. My wife tells me that my son Yitzi has anxiety. That's A. But B, why does he have anxiety? Because we're not ready for Pesach. And my wife says she tried to explain to him that, well, this room is done and your bedroom is ready for Pesach and that room is done and we're doing the kitchen on Sunday and we're making a Pesach date. We're turning it over to make it kosher for Passover on Monday. But then he says, wait, Sunday, that's already after Shabbos. After Shabbos, it's already Pesach. So he was under the impression that Pesach is this week, is this upcoming Shabbos. And the truth is we have another week. Now, this is going to be the Parsha podcast for next week. And as I mentioned in the previous episode, I'm recording it early. Usually we meet Tuesday night at 8 p.m. Central on towardszoom.com. But because it's the week before Pesach, I said I'm going to do 2 episodes in 1 week and give myself plenty of time to work on Pesach. So we still have 8 or so days until Pesach. When you hear this, if you're listening to this in the podcast, it'll be only a couple of days before Pesach. But this is all a long way of saying that this week was a short turnaround. This podcast is a short turnaround. In general, Parshas Tzav, when we have the coalition of Parsha podcasters, when we have our annual conference, we always talk about how difficult Parshas Tzav is because everyone's already in Pesach mode. And it's just the second week in a row of sacrifices. It's maybe the toughest week for Parsha podcasts. And all the Parsha podcasters in Parsha Podcast Con, where we get together, we all discuss it and lament it. That's a joke because there is no Parsha Podcast Conference, but maybe there should be. I don't know. It's a tough Parsha. It's the week before Pesach. It's a short turnaround. But with the help of the Almighty, we have a Parsha podcast. So let's begin. Now, you may say after you listen to this, you know what? Previous Parsha podcasts to Parshas Tzav were better. And this one felt like it was a little bit underbaked. And the reason why is because it is a bit underbaked. So there's something to work with, an idea plus a dilemma. So let's begin. Parshas Tzav continues the theme of Parshas Vayikra, namely sacrifices. And it starts off with the process of the Ola, specifically the evening Karban Tamid Ola. Every single day, the first sacrifice brought in the morning was the Tamid, which means daily, the daily Ola sacrifice of the morning. And the end cap of a day of sacrifices, the final sacrifice, is the afternoon Ola, the Tamid afternoon, which means the ongoing, continuous, repeating every day Ola, the communal offer brought at the end of the day. And our parsha begins where God tells Moshe to instruct Aaron and his sons, command them, Tzav es Aaron, command them. This is the protocol and the process of the Ola, meaning the evening Ola, the last sacrifice of the day. You burn it on top of the altar, and it burns there the whole night until the morning, and the fire of the Mizbeach, of the altar, shall burn on it, or should consistently be burning on top of it. This is the first of 3 times in the first 6 verses that it mentions the fire on top of the altar. Rashi tells us that there are actually 3 ongoing fires. Well, what happens in the morning? So we have the sacrifice, it's processed, it's placed upon the altar, upon the fire on top of the altar. and it burns the whole night. In the morning, what do you have left? You have just some ashes. And in the morning, before the next slate or the next day's slate of sacrifices commence, you have to remove a little bit of the ashes that remained from yesterday's sacrifices. And this is a mitzvah that we're told to remove a little bit of the deshen, of the ashes from the previous day's sacrifices. There is a fire always, even throughout the night, as we shall see. There's always a fire, and the fire is burning what was that day's sacrifices. In the morning, you have some ashes. The Kohen comes and gathers some of the ashes from on top of the altar, and he brings it down the altar and places it near the altar, near the base of the altar. That's the daily activity that kickstarts the day. So the first sacrifice is the Tamid sacrifice of the morning. The last sacrifice is the Tamid sacrifice of the afternoon. But the first activity is the Truma Sadesh, the removal of a bunch of ashes from the previous day's sacrifices. The next verse tells us that on occasion, when the pile of ashes on top of the altar would get quite large, then you wouldn't take a little bit and remove it from the top of the altar to the base of the altar. You would take it all and clear it out and move it outside the camp to a pure place. Meaning, when we deal with the ashes, when the Kohen deals with the ashes on top of the altar, there's the daily removal of a little bit of the ashes, and then there's the occasional removal of all of the ashes, meaning once the pile of ashes gets so big, it is removed outside the camp to a pure place. And then the verse goes back to telling us what is on this altar. There's a fire on the altar, on the Mizbeach, and it's prohibited to extinguish this fire. And every morning, the Kohen places logs of wood on top of the fire to perpetuate the fire. And on this fire, you bring the sacrifices and you take the other parts of the animal, the innards of the animal, and the verse reinforces this idea: a continuous fire shall burn on top of the altar, it shall not be extinguished. There's actually two separate prohibitions regarding the fires on top of the altar: A, to maintain a fire; B, to not extinguish. One's a positive, one is a negative. Of course, there's a lot to discuss here. All sorts of different ceremonies that were done. The daily Ola sacrifice, the removal of the ashes just a little bit, the total removal of all the ashes, and the fire, the three different fires that are atop the altar, and the placement of the logs to maintain and perpetuate that fire. But let's start with an observation. There is a mitzvah, two mitzvahs in fact, to have a fire atop the altar. One is an obligation, a positive mitzvah, to maintain a steady fire atop the altar, even if there are no sacrifices to process. So typically the fire atop the altar is to process the sacrifices. But there must be a fire on top of the altar even if there are no sacrifices at the time to process. And mitzvah number 2 is the prohibition against extinguishing the fire from atop the altar. And the verse tells us 3 times there must be a fire on top of the altar. But there is a bit of an unusual word choice in the verse. Eish ala mizbeach, there should be a fire on top of the mizbeach. Tukad bo, should be lit in it, or in him. If you think of an altar, on top of the altar there's a fire. But it's not like the altar itself is on fire. In fact, there's a film of copper protecting the wood of the altar from catching fire. So on top of the altar, there is wood, and on the wood there, the wood is on fire. The altar itself is not on fire. So many have observed that the word choice of the verse is a bit odd. Why does it say that there's a fire on or in, or more precisely, in the altar, or in him, which is more literal, bo in him? It should say, alav, there is on top of the altar, there's a fire. This is one of those observations that it wouldn't bother us that much. It's a word usage. We have to become much more sensitive to appreciate that. But there's a very famous idea that many of these sages have said. This verse is hinting that every Jew is supposed to be like an altar. And every Jew must have a fire. Every Jew must be alive in their religious life. There must be a fire in him, meaning in the Kohen who's there, who's working on top of the altar. He must be alive. He cannot be dead. He must be vigorously engaged in the spiritual activities that he is doing. And this idea, it's a nice, cute idea, and it fits nicely with many of the other ideas that we've seen in our studies of the tabernacle and the temple and the sacrifices now we're learning about that happen in the tabernacle and the temple. And it always is helpful for us to gain some connection, some relevance to the tabernacle. The whole subject is so foreign. We haven't had a temple in almost 2,000 years. That's a long time. And our sages tell us that for us, we cannot fulfill these mitzvos quite yet. But there's still relevance to us because it shows us images and pictures and frameworks for how we ourselves are supposed to achieve greatness. And when the verse says that there's a fire in him, that is a way of saying, or maybe one of the nuances behind that word usage is that we need to maintain a steady fire. We have to be alive in our spiritual life. We have to be ready to dedicate ourselves to God. We have to be ready to elevate ourselves to God. The Talmud tells us that when we eat, not in the temple, not in Jerusalem, not sacrificial foods, when we eat, we have to imagine that we're placing food on top of the altar. And that's why you're not supposed to even sit on a table, because a table is a regular table in Houston, Texas, that you're eating food on. It has some feeling of being like an altar. And that's why there is a mitzvah, or a custom, a ubiquitous custom, that when you break bread, you dip your bread into the salt, because all sacrifices have salt. And when you're eating food, don't think that you're just a simple person like an animal munching on grass. You're a cow munching on grass. No, you're supposed to be elevated. You're like an altar, and there's a fiery flame within your heart. And what you're eating is not just eating, it's something spiritual and elevated. If there's salt on top of your sacrifices, there is salt as well on top of your food. There is another custom when you're breaking bread to cover the knife. You have a knife. Some people, when they eat bread, they just take a bit of bread and pull it off pieces and ravage the bread. But those are a little bit more, refined. Shabbos meal, you don't just do that. You take a knife and you slice it nicely, the bread, the challah bread. You're supposed to cover the knife while you make the blessing. You're supposed to cover the knife during the grace after meal, during the Birkat Hamazon. Why? Because the table's like an altar, and on the altar we learn you're not supposed to have any metal implements. And that's not just for the altar and the tabernacle and the temple, it's also for the table that you're eating at, the table that is akin to an altar. There is a preference when you make a blessing to make a blessing on a full loaf of bread. Why? Because the altar in the tabernacle and temple, it's only made from full stones. This sounds very strange to us. When we think we're eating lunch, there's nothing spiritual about it. We're just having a sandwich. We're just eating. But no, the Talmud's trying to elevate us and say, when you read about these things, it's not just distant ideas from a long-forgotten temple and tabernacle. These are instructions for us to live a more elevated life. So when we read about what's happening atop the altar and all these laws and the fire, the 3 fires and the multiple fires and the put the logs in the fire and take the ashes off. And sometimes you take just every day, there's just one scoop of ashes, but then on occasion you remove all the ashes. All these laws, they're also supposed to, on some level, teach us about perspectives and frameworks for how we ought to behave and what we ought to emulate and how we can advance in our spiritual lives. The first indication, the first verse of the Torah that talks about the tabernacle, God tells Moshe, build for me a tabernacle, build a sanctuary, v'shachanti b'socham, and I will dwell within them. And all the commentators say, wait a minute, build me a sanctuary, I will dwell within it, not within them. Oh, no. This, I say this tell us, within the hearts of every individual, within the heart of every Jew, you're supposed to build a tabernacle so that it could be a place where God can dwell. The tabernacle is full of insights on how we are supposed to position ourselves for greatness. And there's a fire atop the altar at all times. There must be a fire within us at all times. I want to focus on one particular characteristic of this fire. Really, these three different fires. How did that fire burn? So the verse tells us the Kohen has to position logs of wood atop the altar to hold the fire. And the requirement calls for logs to be placed each morning and each evening to maintain and perpetuate the fire. And in the temple, there was a warehouse that had stockpiles of wood. And there were some priests who were responsible for overseeing the wood log storehouses to select the good wood, and if there's any wormy wood that's not usable, it's disqualified. This is, in fact, one of the only parts of the temple services that can be done by a blemished Kohen. If someone's a Kohen who's blemished, they cannot do work on the temple, they cannot do any sacrificial work, but the maintaining of the wood they can. And each morning and each evening, they would add logs atop the altar. And that's how the fire was maintained and perpetuated and used to burn the sacrifices. But we discover that was not the only source of fire. There was a second fire. There was a heavenly fire. You recall, perhaps, we're going to read this in next week's Parsha. It's not really next week, because next week is Pesach. We miss a week because there's a week of Pesach. But the upcoming Parsha, following Parshas Tzav, is Parshas Shemini, which means the eighth day of the inauguration, when Aaron and his sons take over the reins of the tabernacle. And when Aaron brought his first sacrifice, Moshe went with him. Rashi tells us because the presence of God did not activate. And they went in together and they prayed. And the verse tells us, chapter 9, verse 24, a fire was emitted from before Hashem, from before God, and it consumed the sacrifice that Aaron had placed atop the altar. There was a fire, not a human-created fire, but a fire from heaven. And our sages tell us that actually this fire that came not from a source that we're familiar with, came from heaven. It continued. It endured. It wasn't a one-time event. The only difference is that this was a time where it was visible to all. As we shall see, it was an invisible fire. Unless you were worthy of seeing it, you wouldn't see it. But the fire from heaven was a continuous, perpetual feature of what happened on top of the altar. And we're told it was shaped like a lion. It was a fire, heavenly fire, in the shape of a lion. In the next book, the book of Numbers, we read about the traveling of the tabernacle. When it's time to move and relocate, they have to disassemble the tabernacle, package it all up, and travel. And the verse, this is chapter 4, verse 13 of Numbers. The verse describes what do you do with the altar? You have to clear off all the ashes and cover it with fabric, because all the vessels had to be covered for the duration of the traveling. They weren't exposed. They were covered, packaged nicely. So Rashi there tells us, citing the Talmud, what about the fire? There was a fire on the altar at all times, a heavenly fire. So if you remove the lodge and you clear off all the ashes, you still have the heavenly fire. And you're going to cover it with the fabric. It's going to burn the fabric. So Rashi tells us, quoting from the Talmud, that they would put a special pot. They put it, cap it with a pot. The heavenly fire is capped, crouching like a lion, is capped with a pot, and on top of the pot, they put the fabric, and that's the way they traveled. So there's a fire on top of the altar. Where's the fire coming from? Well, we know there's lodge. You light the fire. We know what fires look like. But now we discover there's a second fire, a fire that descended from heaven. It was shaped like a lion. Now, when the Talmud introduces this, it cites one of the sages who said, wait a minute. I saw the fire atop the altar. Not just the fire made by humans, the fire from heaven. And it was not shaped like a lion. It was shaped like a dog. So the Talmud resolves this question by saying, no. During the first temple, the presence of God was more palpable. And therefore, everything was more lofty. And the fire was like a lion. You were an associate high priest in the second temple era. And then it was less impressive. It was shaped like a cute little puppy. What do we know about these fires, or this spiritual fire? So we're told several things about it. This is in the Talmud, Book of Yoma, page 21b. So it crouched like a lion. That's number one. We know that already. It was clear, meaning it you could see right through it. It was translucent. But if you touched it, it had substance to it. You touch a fire, not advised. We don't advise that. But if someone were to touch a fire, like you could run your finger. My kids like doing that, right? You take a fire, you just run, try to jump over and run your hand through it. You know those kids, right? This fire was not like that. It had substance. That's the third thing that we're told about it. It was so powerful that if you have an ordinary fire, you always look for, when you're trained to make a fire, you want to find dry wood, right? Because if it's wet, it won't burn well. This fire did not distinguish, did not discriminate. It consumed wet wood as if it were dry. And unlike other fires, it did not emit a smoke. There was no smoke. This is an elevated, spiritual, heavenly, ethereal fire. And as I mentioned earlier, unless you had the spiritual eyes, the spiritual senses, you couldn't see it. The great sage said, I saw it. He's saying, I saw it. No one else saw it. I was the associate high priest, very elevated sage. Ani re'isia, I saw it. It was like a dog, not like a lion, like you're saying. Only those who trained their eyes to see spiritual matters could see it. We talked about this recently, how when Abraham got to the binding of Isaac's site and he asks his companions, do you see what I see? And Isaac said, yes, I see the cloud hovering above the mountain. Abraham saw it, Isaac saw it, but Ishmael and Eliezer did not. So this elevated sage, the associate high priest, he saw it and he says, wait, it wasn't shaped like a lion, it was shaped like a dog. So he said, no. First temple versus second temple. So you have this remarkable heavenly fire that was initiated on the first day of operations of the tabernacle. And it continued all the way through the first temple. And then during the second temple as well, a much lower level, there was always a heavenly fire present. At the time of the inauguration of the tabernacle, we have food coming down from heaven, and now we know that we have fire coming down from heaven too. Yet, the verse tells us, you should put logs on top of the altar so that way you have a fire. Logs in the morning and logs in the afternoon. The logs must be added. Why do you need a second fire? Wouldn't it be nice for the tabernacle, for the temple, to reduce its carbon footprint? You don't need to burn the fossil fuels. You have a heavenly fire. This question is asked by the Talmud. Why do you have to make a fire when there is a fire there? And the Talmud answers, even though there's a fire from heaven, still it's a mitzvah to create a fire, a human-made fire, to supplement the heavenly fire with a human-made fire. It's an amazing thing. We have the best, most powerful, most potent, magical, mysterious, miraculous, heavenly fire, crouching like a lion atop the altar. It's clear. And it says, it's clear as the light of the sun, the Talmud tells us. It's powerful. It has some substance to it. It could consume the wet as well as the dry. It doesn't raise any smoke. It's the best fire that has ever existed. But the Talmud tells us, you also have to add a fire from humans. And the question is why? And perhaps there are many answers to this question, but there's one answer in particular that's a very powerful and counterintuitive answer. This comes from the Sefer HaChinuch in mitzvah number 132. He tells us that when God does a miracle, he conceals the miracle. And he presents a miracle in a way that it could be misinterpreted as just something natural, or at least close enough to be natural. What's the greatest miracle of them all? The greatest suspension of nature of them all? Well, that's the splitting of the sea. The nation's trapped, and suddenly the sea splits. They're able to walk in dry land, and there's walls of water on either side of them. And then the Egyptians, they follow suit, and the walls of water crash down upon them and drown them. That's a miracle, right? Well, what does the verse say prior to that? Chapter 14, verse 21 of Exodus. The verse says that the entire night before the splitting of the sea, God brought a very strong easterly wind that was sloshing the water around in a tempest for the entire night. And then in the morning, the sea split. God made it like as if it was a tornado alley, as if it's a tsunami. And that could be an interpretation. Well, this is no miracle. These things happen on occasion. It's just a well-timed, well-placed, fortuitous tsunami. That's what you could have said. And you know what? It's accurate, because the miracle is concealed. The miracle is presented in a way that, yes, it is an act of nature, so to speak, but it's perfectly designed to save us. And that's maybe the definition of a miracle. Or at least that could be interpreted as a definition of the miracle. Similarly, God makes a miracle for the 40 years that the nation's in the wilderness. There's a fire crouching like a lion. For the 400 plus years of the first temple, there's a fire crouching like a lion at all times on top of the altar. for the 369 years of the temple at Shiloh and the 400 plus years of the temple, second temple era, there's a fire. And it's a miracle. But God says, you know what? Put on logs and make sure it's lit and make sure that it's possible for you to not even notice the miracle at all. You could be there and witness the temple for 500 years straight and never even know that there's a miracle. That's a very interesting idea, that when God does a miracle, he conceals it. Now, he doesn't bring this example, but there's another interesting example that the Ramban writes about. In Parshas Noach, of all places, during the flood, before the flood, Noah, build me an ark. Well, how big should the ark be? 100 cubits by 50 cubits by 30 cubits tall, and make lots of compartments. Why do we need such a big ark? Well, we have to save all the species from this terrible flood that's going to destroy everything that's not inside said ark. Well, how big is this ark compared to the last zoo that you went to? I bet you the last zoo was bigger. Now, I have a problem with zoos, because the problem that I have with zoos is that they make the humans do all the walking. They should make the animals do all the walking. The person who invents this, where you could stay in one place and all the animals march in front of you, that's the winning idea. But zoos should be miles and miles of walking. They're bigger than the ark. You cannot have all the animals inside the ark. There's still not enough room. So it's still a miracle that all the animals fit. It's pretty big, the ark, but it's not big enough. That's the Ramban's question. So he says, well, it's a miracle, so just make a little canoe. And in the canoe comes one animal, and well, if it's a miracle, what difference does it make? Why does he have to spend 120 years building this enormous boat? A small little rowboat. That should be enough. If it's a miracle, what difference does it make? And he gives the exact same answer. Miracles are concealed. Miracles are not overt, are not revealed in a way that they are undeniable. It's interesting that the Hebrew word for a miracle, nes, is the same word or the same root as nisayon, which means a test. Miracles are grounds for tests because the miracles are concealed. So we see an interesting policy, a divine policy. When he does the miracle, he conceals it. There's a fire at all times on top of this altar, but at all times, there's also a human fire that shields it, that conceals it, that hides it from view. We're told every one of us has to have a fire within ourselves, a fire at all times. There should be a fire bow in him. The Kohen must be alive and vigorous and vibrant in his spiritual alertness. We have to have a fire. But here we learn that there's multiple fires and there's an imperative to conceal it. We learned a few weeks ago, we cited the Talmud, there's only blessing in that is hidden. If this description of the altar and the tabernacle is a description of our pursuit of spiritual greatness, when we learn that for hundreds of years there was a miracle right in front of everyone's eyes, but hidden from view, that is to teach us that we must conceal our spiritual torch, our greatness. And this is one of the great patterns that we find by all the heroes of our history. They took a great effort to try to conceal their greatness. My grandfather, blessed memory, used to say that he wants to write a set of biographies. Not just one. He wants to write 20 biographies. 10 biographies of greats of the nations. Great people who did great things amongst the nations. And 10 biographies of sages of our people. Because what's the contrast, the greatness that we have versus the greatness in the world at large? The greatness of those who are uninfluenced, unaffected by Torah. And he spoke about 2 of the biographies he wanted to write. One was about a guy named Albert Schweitzer. Now that name doesn't quite ring, it's not as powerfully as it used to. But this guy was a professor, and he was in a very prestigious university. And he learned about people in third world countries that maybe they don't have medicine, they don't have money, they can't heal themselves, they don't know about religion or God. So he said, I'm gonna go help him. And he gave up his position, and he went to learn medicine, and he became a physician and traveled, I think, to Africa. I don't know exactly the story. And he began to heal people, a real special person. I tried to teach him about God as well. We don't know exactly what version of faith he had. But he gave up a lot for the sake of helping others. Special person. But, of course, he gets back to Europe and writes a whole biography. Everyone's got to know the story. Everyone's got to know all the details of all my exploits and greatness. And you compare that to the Chazon Ish, who spent his whole life helping people and never said a word about it. Never said a word. Always concealed his greatness. A few weeks ago, we recorded a podcast about the Chafetz Chaim. And there was a story that I did not say on that podcast because I saved it for today. Someone came to the Chafetz Chaim and he had a very rare illness. Now, when I heard the story, one time I heard it was a rare illness. Second time I heard it he was epileptic. I don't know the details of the story, but the contours are the same. A Jew comes to the Chafetz Chaim, I have this terrible illness. Can you do something for me? Could you pray for me? Could you help me? He says, listen, I can't help you, but I want you to go to this rabbi. This someone you know, but he lives in this town. You go to him, you ask him for a blessing, and hopefully when you ask a blessing from him, you'll be healed. But my condition is that you don't mention a word of this to anyone. You have to tell me, you can't talk about this to anyone. So the man agrees, he has no choice. He agrees to the terms of the Chafetz Chaim, and he says, okay, he travels to that town, and he meets this rabbi, and the rabbi has no idea why the Chafetz Chaim sent this poor, suffering Jew to him. But the Chafetz Chaim wants me to give him a blessing, so he gave him a blessing. And he gave him a blessing, and the man went home, and he got better. A miracle. Amazing. But he wasn't allowed to tell anyone what happened. Wasn't allowed to tell anyone what happened. A few years later, he's healed, thank God, from his condition. But someone in his family has the exact same condition. And everyone knows that he had it, and somehow he ameliorated it, and they say to him, what happened? Like, how did you solve this problem? He says, I'm sorry, I can't help you. I can't talk to you about it. It's a secret. I can't tell you. You see your sister-in-law, she's suffering. You're not going to tell her what happened, what the story is? I'm sorry, I can't tell. And they're badgering him and they're pressuring him. And at one point he just gives in. And he tells them, there's this rabbi, the Chafetz Chaim sent me to this rabbi, and I got the blessing and I was healed. He says that, and soon afterwards, again, I heard different versions of the story. One version I heard is 3 months later, and that version maybe was a little more dramatized. Right away, he starts shaking uncontrollably. His illness has returned. He's in a pickle now. He tries to find that old rabbi that helped him. But in the time since he first had the condition until now, that rabbi has been deceased. But what to do? Well, the Chafetz Chaim is still alive. So he goes to the Chafetz Chaim. And he tells him, listen, I violated my pledge not to reveal what happened. And now I have this condition back again. And the Chafetz Chaim says, I'm sorry, I cannot help you. And he basically reveals to him that what comes out of the story is that the Chafetz Chaim, he says, I'm too old to do what I did last time. Last time he said he fasted and he prayed nonstop for this person to be healed. But he didn't want the credit. So he said to him, you go speak to this other rabbi, anonymous rabbi. This guy thinks that this other rabbi is helping him, his prayer, his blessing. But really, it was the Chafetz Chaim who was fasting for 40 days and 40 nights. Maybe not in a row. But he was fasting and praying and crying his heart out to the Almighty for a miracle to help this person. But when miracles happen, you have to conceal it. You have to conceal it. So he tells him, well, go speak to this and this person and this far-flung town and ask him for a blessing. And that was the covering of the tracks. And this story is a very remarkable story because it shows us the concern that the Chafetz Chaim had for, just some Jew that he never know came to visit who needed some help. But this idea is a reinforcement of this concept. Miracles must be concealed. Greatness must be concealed. The heavenly fire must be concealed. Now, if God, when he does a miracle, he hides it. If we want to achieve miracles, we must hide them as well. If a miracle can only happen when it's covered up, it's not overt and incontrovertibly unimpeachable to all. If it's hidden, and you want to have a little bit of that sort of greatness, you want to be a bearer of a miracle of your own, it must be hidden. Both revealed and concealed miracles are hidden. The miracle of the heavenly fire was masked, it was covered, it was concealed. We see in the tabernacle, there was the ark. And the ark was really composed of two different vessels. There was the ark, and there was the cover of the ark, upon which the cherubs were hewn. And if you read the verses, it's clear that these are two different vessels. One is a receptacle for the tablets, and one is a cover for the tablets. You want greatness. You have to have A, a receptacle for greatness, and B, you have to have a cover for it. You have to be like the ark, golden inside and out, and like the ark, it needs to be covered. There has to be a degree of modesty. Only with modesty can there be greatness. Modesty is absolutely crucial for any pursuit of Torah, any pursuit of greatness, any pursuit of something transcendental. If you're going to have a heavenly fire operating within you, it must be hidden. Our spiritual accomplishments and pursuits are the most precious things that we have. And the more precious something is, the more we must conceal it. When we flaunt them, God forbid, they fizzle away and they are at risk for being lost. I know people, you may find this strange, that will never share pictures of their children. You walk into their house, they have lots of children, you won't see any pictures. They'll hide it in their own bedroom. Why? Because you want to have something and earn something and preserve something and have the full power of something? The way to do it is to hide it. My grandfather, blessed memory, he would never reveal to anyone what he's actually working on himself. I was once privy to something I shouldn't have seen. My grandfather was almost 90 at the time. And it was the festival of Sukkot. And I happened to have been up very, very early in the morning, or maybe very, very late at night. It was kind of that point where you're not sure if it's late night or early morning. And I saw my grandfather and my grandmother sneaking into the sukkah. And my grandfather was pulling out the lulav and the esrog. And I'm like, what's happening? But I was hiding. I was like far away, and I didn't want to jump in and disrupt the party. But later on, I discovered there's some sort of Kabbalistic thing to come into the sukkah middle of the night or early in the morning and pull out the lulav and esrog, like some sort of super, super Kabbalistic idea. And they were like kind of going in surreptitiously. No one's watching. They did it quiet, never told a soul about it. I happen to have seen it. Greatness, that fire that if we're lucky to have within ourselves, and the fire, the super, super fire, the fire that we have from heaven, our soul is like a fire. It's like a candle. It's like a lamp. And it's hidden within ourselves. And that raw power is what enables us to achieve stratospheric greatness. The more we expose of it to others, the more we publicize our accomplishments, the less of a connection that we'll have to this, and the less potent our greatness will be. It's a powerful lesson. We're supposed to be like the altar. And all of us, want others to think highly of us and love the idea of our righteousness being publicized. Wouldn't that be great if everyone knows just how awesome I am? We see something very fine here, very subtle. There was a fire from heaven for over 1,000 years. And it was hidden. It was hidden, essentially hidden. It was clear. And it was deliberately concealed. There must be a fire. You must always have another fire to make sure that no one, unless someone who's very sensitive enough to see it, but no, it's not going to be publicized to anyone. A very powerful and subtle idea. Let's get to this week's dilemma. When someone does something maybe regrettable, they do something wrong, they do something they shouldn't have done, but they paid the price for their behavior. They were punished. They repented from their misdeed. They got what they deserved. Someone maybe lived a life that was not ideal, let's say. They had forgotten about their Creator. But they changed, and they returned, and they resurrected their relationship with God. How are we supposed to feel? How are they supposed to feel about their past? There are two ways to rectify the past. Either they're punished, or they repented, which is a form of punishment. It's a form of internal change, where you wrestle with who you have been and who you want to be. And that's a very painful experience as well. Change is always painful. But how are we supposed to think about someone who has changed? How are we supposed to relate to their previous self? One of the great sages says something very interesting about the protocol of the removal of the ashes. The ashes of the sacrifice that was burned on top of the altar. And the Ramban tells us when a sacrifice is burned on top of the altar, the bringer of the sacrifice is supposed to imagine in their mind that really what's happening to the sacrifice should be happening to them. If someone didn't clap for Stalin when he spoke, they'd be shot that day. I think I read once that he was once speaking And they were all clapping, and they clapped for 10 minutes, 12 minutes, nonstop. And everyone was scared to be the first one to stop. I think the first one who stopped was shot. Like you just do anything wrong against the dictator. Well, that's grounds for immediate summary execution. Now, Stalin is long gone. I heard a story about the death of Stalin. There was a great rabbi who was exiled to Siberia. And he was there, and there was very few Jews in Siberia where he was. Certainly Jews that were interested in hearing the Purim story, but it was Purim, and he wanted to tell over the story of Purim. They didn't have Megillah, so he just told over the whole story. There was this terrible king and this terrible advisor, and they wanted to kill us all, and Hashem saved us. That's the very short version of the story. So one of the people that were there said to them, why are we worried about this king who lived 2,500 years ago in Persia? We have the Haman of our day. We have Stalin doing terrible things. He says to them, Stalin, what do you worry about Stalin? Stalin's here today and gone tomorrow. What are you worried about him? Anyhow, when that rabbi said that, the next day they discovered, Stalin actually was gone tomorrow. It was the day before he died. Rabbi says, he's here today, gone tomorrow. He's gone. The Almighty God is the creator of all of us, sustainer of all of us, almighty, all-powerful, all-knowing, omnipotent, omniscient. If someone violates the will of God on some level, they have no right to live anymore. Says the Ramban, when you bring a sacrifice, you see the animal being burned on top of the altar, you have to think in your head, well, if I did anything wrong against God, really, I should be on top of the altar. So the burning of the animal is a way, God in his benevolence gives us a way to atone for our misdeeds in that benign way, but also it's a way for us to repent. And what happens? The animal's turned into ashes. You take the ashes, and you move it off the stage left. We don't linger on those misdeeds. We clear them off. We move on. We forget. If someone repents, the Rambam tells us, the Almighty testifies about them, they're cleansed. And no one should remind them or should even remember their previous self. After we die, we're going to have to give an accounting and a reckoning for our behavior. And if we're lucky, we'll become, I always say this just to make people uncomfortable, get your attention. If we're very, very lucky, we'll go to Gehinnom. What? I thought if you're lucky, you go to heaven. No, that's only if you're completely pure. Not a single sin, not a single misdeed. And everything you did do, you repented for. Very few people qualify. If you're lucky, if you're righteous, if you're meritorious, well, that means you fulfilled what Hashem wanted you to fulfill. So all you need to do is just to clean out those slight blemishes, power wash, polish, remove some of the dents that you've gotten, but you fulfilled what Hashem wanted you to fulfill. Now, from what I know about that place, it's not very pleasant. But it is a process of cleansing. And once someone finishes that cleansing, no one is allowed to mention anything of their previous inappropriate behavior. And if this is the policy of Almighty God, this is the policy that we should have with others. And you know what? Even with ourselves, if we're fortunate enough to have overcome a challenge. Oh, I'm going to say something again controversial. Ooh, I'm going to get myself into trouble. That's fine. Most people stop listening to the podcast like after 40 minutes. But if someone's fortunate enough to have overcome, it's important for them to celebrate you're not that same person. Here's where I'm going to get into trouble. Someone told me, okay, they went to they've been sober for 50 years. And they're still going around saying, I'm an alcoholic. I've always been alcoholic. I'll be an alcoholic. No, I don't agree. You stopped being an alcoholic some time ago. Okay, I got in trouble. Everyone's like, send me the emails. Hate mail to rabbi@wolbejima.com. I understand. It's not popular. But this is what the Torah is telling us. It's possible for a person to change. You don't need to be the same person that you always were. No, you're not just, I'll always be an alcoholic. No, maybe not. Maybe you've fixed yourself. Maybe you've changed. Maybe you have overcome, and we could take a little bit of that previous self and take it and clear it off the altar. Okay, controversial. Send me the hate mail. You know where it is, rabbi@wolbejima.com. Have a wonderful day. Have a splendid rest of your week. Hope your preparations for Pesach are going fabulous. You should have a wonderful Shabbos, a fantastic and happy and healthy and kosher Pesach. And please God, with the help of the Almighty, we'll talk again not next week, because after Parshas Tzav comes Parsha Shmini, which happens after Pesach. So we have a whole week with no Parsha. Of course, there's lots of other things to do, lots of other things to study in the shul. We do read from the Torah, just not something which is the next installment of the Parsha. It's something that's relates to Passover, to Pesach. All the different days have different readings. So we'll talk again, I guess, in 2 weeks. I'm looking forward to that. My email address is rabbi@wolbe@gmail.com. I look forward to your questions, your comments, and your feedback.